Well, good afternoon, friends. It's afternoon here. Perhaps it's not afternoon where you're hearing this, but it's a pleasure to be with you again, and a privilege for a Presbyterian to speak to his Baptist brothers on this subject at their request. And we love the Word of God together, so I'm sure we'll profit from the Word of God as we consider it today. Now, previously, I think it was on the 2nd of August, I spoke to you about the eldership, and we looked at the background to the eldership in the Old Testament, and we moved to the New Testament, where the office appears very suddenly without any explanation in Acts chapter 11 and verse 30. I got a bit confused about where that was. I couldn't see it in the Bible I had in front of me last time, but I was right. It was in verse 30 where we just read about the elders of the church. And there's clearly a case where the eldership in the Old Covenant is taken over into the New. There are adjustments, of course, because of the nature of things, but there it was. So we looked at that background, and then we looked at 1 Timothy chapter 3, and particularly the qualifications there in verses 3 to 7, 1 to 7 of that chapter, the qualifications for eldership. And the qualifications then, what you must be as an elder, then the exertions, what you must do, and then the duties of the eldership, the duties he has towards the people and the duties they have toward him, what he may expect perhaps from others, and what he will give to others. Well, this time we're going to look at 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verses 17 to 25. And as in my own congregations here in Melbourne, where we're looking to be running some eldership training later in the year, I was glad to do this, as it means I'm not only serving you, but serving our own people later too. We only touched on it briefly in 1 Timothy chapter 5. But before we look at this passage, I want us just to have a look at the structure of the book. It's always good to look at something like that, because it can help us see where the emphasis lies in the book. And I've offered here an analysis or an idea of the structure of the book. Now, lots of people think that 1 Timothy, it's pastoral problems and issues, and it just goes through them and there's no particular order or structure. But I think otherwise is the case. And while we're not spending a great deal of time upon this, I want you to look at that structure. Those of you who've got an order of service for this particular service will be able to see it. But I'll just explain it a little bit more. You see, it's very common in biblical literature to have a chiastic structure. Well, what's that mean, you say? Well, a chiastic structure means that it's a rhetorical practice, very common in both Old Testament, and you find it in the New Testament too, a very suitable kind of a device when people are writing or speaking in an oral culture. It helps people memorize the content of what they're hearing. But at any rate, the chiastic structure is this, that you get a central point in a particular narrative. But building up to that point, there may be three particular sections. Well, it's three in this case. And then moving out from that central section, you'll also have three more sections that move out from that central section, and they correspond in language and ideas in different ways to those first three sections that moved into the centre point. So that's the general idea. Now, I've suggested a structure here, and if you look, for example, at the first chapter of Timothy, you'll see there words about fighting the good fight, not swerving from the faith. And if you look at the last chapter, you'll find the same terminology, fighting the good fight and not going astray from the faith. Similar ideas and language. And in the second section, which really is chapter 2, you've got godliness in the membership of the congregation. There were obviously issues among the members in relationship to the roles of the men and the women and so on. And so that's a feature there. And then when you come to the corresponding section in chapter 5, from verse 17 to 25, and that's our section today, we're talking about godliness in the leadership of the congregation. And then the third section is godliness, that is leadership that is without reproach. You find that in chapter 3, verses 1 to 13. And then in the corresponding section, moving out from the central point, you've got the question about widows, the treating of widows, elderly people on their own. Should the church support them? Yes, under certain circumstances, they are to be supported. Elders who are without reproach. And then the central section to which all this leads and then also moves out from is godliness in God's house. And you have particularly in verse 14 there of chapter 3, and remember the chapter divisions are quite a late thing, and they're not always quite ideal. We've got in 1 Timothy 3 and verse 14 this: "Although I hope to come to you soon, I am writing you these instructions, so that if I'm delayed, you will know how people ought to conduct themselves in God's house, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and foundation of the truth." So he's already written things, and he says why he's writing them. He's writing them so you know how to conduct yourself in the house of God. And then he goes on and says, beyond all question, the mystery of godliness is great. And here he speaks about our Lord Jesus Christ in three sections or three units here. He appeared in a body, was vindicated by the Spirit, referring to his incarnation and his vindication through the resurrection. He was seen by angels, was preached among the nations, was believed on in the world, was taken up in glory. And then he goes on a little bit further here, down to verse 2 of chapter 5. He goes on and speaks about godliness in God's house in various features, reminding them that godliness is so important and that in fact you've got to keep guard against the errors that can come in and the false doctrines and teachings that come in. And then he comes to deal with the question of widows without reproach, corresponding to the leadership without reproach in the previous section that I mentioned, moving out then to godliness in the leadership of the congregation, and then fighting the good fight. Now that's a bit lengthy, and if you haven't got the analysis in front of you, I don't know whether this will end up on the website or whatever, but it will be helpful anyway to have a look at that. And if you look carefully at the language in the different sections, you'll see that there's, I think, reason to justify this. I've not actually, I don't have that many commentaries on 1 Timothy, and the ones I have don't have this, but I think that's the way it ought to go. But whatever the merit or otherwise of this structure, the big thing is godliness is the chief theme of the book. Godliness has to be characteristic of God's household, whatever it is, and it's conduct that's shaped by that little sort of verse that comes there at the end of chapter 3 that speaks about what Christ has done. That's reminding us, you see, that godliness is conduct that's shaped by the work that's accomplished by Christ, and that's been announced now, even in the world, and is acknowledged indeed. Also, it's believed on in the world, and he was taken up in glory. Now, we can't unpack that very solid little piece of theological instruction that's really at the heart of understanding our lives as Christians. But that's the point. So godliness in the congregation was the feature in chapter 2. But now, in verses 17 to 25 of chapter 5, it's godliness in the leadership of the congregation. So it's not a big section we've got today, but let's just see what we're going to make of it. The first thing is this. We read there, the elders who, or presbyters, that's the Greek word, presbyteros, or presbyteroi, the elders who rule well. So what does that mean? Does it mean that there are some elders who don't rule well? And I think the answer to that is yes, for the reasons that I will give. Now, obviously, among the elders, there are differences in ability, differences in efficiency, difference in their health that affects their ability. And so the instruction here, let the elders who rule well, is not something that's to be taken as meaning there's no criticism possible of an elder. In fact, if we read on, we find that there are various instructions given concerning elders who do not rule well. So we're going to look at those first of all. He says here, verse 19, do not entertain an accusation against an elder unless it's brought by 2 or 3 witnesses. Those who sin are to be rebuked publicly so the others may take warning. I charge you in the sight of God and Christ Jesus and the elect angels to keep these instructions without partiality and to do nothing out of favoritism. Do not be hasty in the laying on of hands and do not share in the sins of others. Keep yourself pure. Stop drinking only water and use a little wine because of your stomach and your frequent illnesses. The sins of some men are obvious, reaching the place of judgment ahead of them. The sins of others trail behind them. In the same way, good deeds are obvious, and even those that are not cannot be hidden. So in this passage, there's a great deal about what to do when elders are not doing the right thing. So we need to look at that. And often I think this passage we quote about the honour due to elders, and we're going to do that too, but we have to just take note of this point. When it says, let the elders who rule well, it implies that some may not rule well from time to time, and that steps need to be taken to deal with that, because godliness in the house of God is the vital emphasis in this epistle. So what do we do here? Well, you have to be careful in entertaining accusations against an elder. 2 or 3 witnesses are required in verse 19. Now, that goes back, of course, to the Old Testament, to Deuteronomy 19, where it's required that there be 2 or 3 witnesses in a case, that you can't just go on rumour and innuendo and so on. There have to be some evidence. We can't read the heart, but we can read conduct, and that needs to be attested by people who can say, yes, we saw this. Not that someone told me about it, but yes, I saw it. So this idea of a proper procedure to guard and protect everyone, in fact. In the Old Testament, if you brought false witness, of course you would have done to you what you intended to do to the person against whom you brought that false witness. So the first thing is, yes, elders may go astray, but they also may be subject to false accusations. So the principle of adequate evidence, and normally that would be 2 or 3 witnesses, is necessary. Now, there are cases where that 2 or 3 witnesses, the principle behind it, can be carried out without actually 2 or 3 witnesses in the ordinary sense. And I'm thinking here of sexual abuse, for example, where normally there is no witness to it. But if several people, for example, independently of each other, came forward with an allegation of abuse on the part of an elder, and they're quite independent, then you may well be meeting the requirement here, even though you don't have 2 or 3 witnesses of the actual act, because normally there's only one other party. So let's not get too biblicist in the wrong sense and just sort of take these words without looking at the principle behind them. You have to have evidence. Leaders in particular need to be protected. There's always someone who will want to cause trouble if the devil gets into their hearts. And so they want to pull down the leadership, gossip against them and so forth. So that's the first thing. The second thing is this. Those who are found to be sinning are to receive public rebuke. Godliness in conduct is a priority. Now, clearly, those who are found to be sinning, it's normally going to be something that in fact is public. It's not a case here of kind of sneaking into the elder's house or peering through the window to see what he's doing at the dinner table. That's not the issue here. There's some conduct. I suspect, in fact, that if you look at the conduct that's described as required of an elder in 1 Timothy chapter 3, one imagines that the sins commonly found among elders in the early church were likely to have been over-imbibing in wine, maybe violent outbursts, quarrelsomeness, acting doubtfully perhaps in money matters, not managing the household appropriately. These were particular qualifications, you remember, for eldership. And perhaps it's neglect of those things or failure in those things. that's particularly in mind, and these people needed to be rebuked publicly. It's not a case of saying, well, he's a leader, we can't embarrass the rest of the church and say anything about this, we'll hush it. It's to be rebuked publicly because it is a public or general sin that's involved. Now again, of course, that doesn't mean that an elder who's caught sinning, found to be sinning, is just rebuked and then nothing more. He may need to be stood down. There's to be actually no partiality or favouritism in dealing with this matter, verse 21. In carrying out these instructions, it's not a question, well, he's a relative, he's a friend, or we really like him, or look, he's good at preaching. If we stand down, we won't have anyone to help us out in the preaching. No, you have to act without partiality. And I am sure that much of the failure of the church is a failure to carry out consistently the standards of the Word of God. We tend to sort of gloss over them. And we don't think that gossiping, for example, is a serious sin, and tail biting and so forth. We have to address those things if we mean business with God and if we mean to have any impact on the wider community, I would suggest. Now, Paul had already, in maybe about 57 AD, he had warned the elders at Ephesus, and this is where Timothy is actually, he's in Ephesus at this particular time. He'd warned that the elders in Ephesus, when he parted from them, that doctrinal errors involving departure from the faith would occur among them. Now, it's about 7 years later perhaps, and he's writing to Timothy, and he notes that there was false teaching in his first chapter in Ephesus. And Paul reminds Timothy that this is in fact a characteristic of the time inaugurated by Christ's resurrection. And he says the same thing in the second letter actually. In 2 Timothy 3 verse 1, and don't you know that in the last times perilous times will come? And those last times are not in the future, they're there in the present. These are the last times that inaugurated by Christ's resurrection. And so in those sort of cases of doctrinal error of that kind, the penalty may be removal from office and even the church itself. And that's implied in what he says elsewhere. But in this particular place, he emphasises there has to be public rebuke. Now, that's not something that's carried out too much. Usually a person is allowed to resign and no one says boo. I'm not sure that that's how it should happen. Now, again he says, still on this same issue about elders who don't rule well, he says, look, you need to avoid haste in laying on of hands. Verse 14. Otherwise is verse 14? Otherwise you where is it? I've lost my place now. Verse 22, is it? You've got to be, avoid haste in laying on of hands, because that was the normal way in which a person was set apart. That's how Timothy himself had been set apart by the hands of the elders being laid upon him. It was a sense of identifying with that person, of commending him to the Lord and seeking the Lord's blessing. And you need to be careful, he says, otherwise you will be sharing in the sin of that person. So you don't just say to the first fellow who comes along who's got lots of orthodox teaching on his lips that, right, we'll make him an elder. You've got to be careful. There are plenty who with joy receive the word and soon fall away. There are plenty who've got the gift of the gab or other things like that, and yet they fail. Test. Take time. Don't rush in. Paul went on a missionary journey, and then when he came back, he visited those churches and they appointed elders in all the churches. So don't delay too much necessarily, but don't be too hasty. Now there's an exhortation here in the midst of all this that might seem strange. And that's the exhortation to Timothy to stop drinking only water. But to use a little wine because of his stomach and his frequent illnesses in verse 23. But I suggest it's actually not out of place here in this context if the point is to divert Timothy from excessive asceticism, that is really living a very restricted life, disciplining himself over severely. And water, of course, in those times was notoriously unsatisfactory, not terribly healthy, which is why everyone drank wine or something like that, because that was much more safe. I remember years ago, many years ago now, coming through Turkey, we didn't touch the water, my wife and I, this is back in the 70s, we didn't touch the water, we drank, we got our fluid from eating melons. You could get watermelon readily enough. That was a lot safer than getting the water because they don't have adequate sewerage systems. The same is true of early Methodism. They were not total abstainers. They drank wine or beer because the water was so bad until the 19th century when major sewerage was established in England. So there's no encouragement here, of course, for excess. But I think he's saying, look, Timothy, you're a man who's very disciplined even in your diet, and it's not helping you. You're often ill and you're drinking water and the water may not be helping you very much. Therefore, and maybe that's affecting your approach to some of the issues in the church. You're not able to be as focused as you might. It seems to me that's the explanation that comes in there, because he then goes on continuing to speak about the elders. And he says, look, the sins of some are obvious, but others are not easily seen. Some people you know and can see their sin, but others it takes time for it to be seen. This principle is true in relation also to good deeds. Therefore, you don't be too quick to disqualify someone just because he hasn't got the fullness that you would like to see, perhaps. We all take time to mature. His true character will show it in time. So don't be too hasty, but don't be too slow. So that's the sort of balance. So elders who rule well. Yes, there are some who fail to rule well after they've been appointed and set apart, and they need to be dealt with in an appropriate way. So that's the first point. That gets actually the largest amount in this section, the largest amount of words. But now let's come to the next one. The next thing is that the elders who rule well are worthy of double honour. Now, what's that mean? Well, it certainly means support in money or kind, as the quotations that immediately follow in verse 18 show you. Because we're told there from the Old Testament, don't muzzle the oxen treading out the corn. They let the oxen feed as they were treading out the corn. And that was fair enough, but there's a principle. Is this just a principle for them about their treatment of animals, or does it raise another principle, that those who minister in spiritual things are entitled to be supported by those who receive that ministration? Paul's quite specific about that. The labourer is worthy of his hire. The worker is entitled to his wages. So it certainly includes that. But what's it mean when it says that the elders are worthy of double honour? So what's the honour here? Well, it's been suggested that as well as the honour that is due to the office that a person holds in the church, then there is also the honour due to his hard work. That is appropriate financial support. So double refers literally to two levels of honour. The honour due to the office and the honour due to his hard work, which will then involve him receiving appropriate recompense for that. A variation on this view is that as well as the honour due to the faithful discharge of his office, the elder also deserves the honour, according to his situation, of suitable financial support. And then there's a third view, perhaps I could mention, this is the view Calvin has. He says it could be a double payment compared with the honour that truly needy widows, verse 3 of chapter 5, placed on the list for support by the church, verse 9, receive. Double in this case is not meant literally, but it doesn't mean that they should receive twice the amount the church allows to a widow who's on her own, but it doesn't mean literally that, but it has the idea of an adequate support that would, of course, generally be more than a widow on her own would need. And you see this term honour is used there in verse 3. Translations may vary somewhat, but it's the same word. Give proper recognition to those widows who are really in need. Give honour to them. So elders who rule well are worthy of double honour. They're worthy of respect, and they're worthy of suitable compensation, some support according to the circumstances. So I would suggest, don't take double here literally. It's just an indication that they're deserving of support, and it will be, in fact, more support than the widow, normally speaking, but sometimes it will be less. And of course, we have to remember that financial support is a right for the preacher of the Word of God, but it's not obligatory to receive it. Paul didn't receive it, as he tells us in 1 Corinthians 9, because he felt it was better to work with his own hands. He, like every Jewish man, was trained for a trade, as well as for every Jewish man had some sort of trade, even if he was going to be a rabbi, and he worked with his own hands as a leather worker, so as to be able to avoid the criticism that could come that he was only in it for the money, especially in those days, because there were people who were professional talkers for what they could get. So here we have elders who rule well. Yes, some don't rule well, and they've got to be dealt with in an appropriate way. But those who are worthy, those who rule well, are worthy of double honour, and it certainly means respect, and it certainly means that they should be supported, even if they voluntarily decline to receive it for reasons that they feel are good. Now, there's not a great deal of practical difference when it comes to it with the different views I've mentioned about double honour. But of course, there are some interesting issues that rise here. For example, if elders are delegated to an assembly or a conference, and I appreciate Baptists don't have any group outside the local church that control it, but still you may have and you should have opportunities of fellowship. If you're delegated to those sort of fellowship to get discussion and get some advice and ideas, if an elder is delegated to that, and I'm not thinking here so much of the preaching elder, to whom we'll come in a moment, because he will be already being supported, but what about someone who's working in an office or a factory or wherever, and he has to take time off work to attend such a meeting? Should he be compensated? I've never seen it in a Presbyterian situation. Obviously the expenses of the meeting would be covered, or getting to the meeting, but I've never seen it if the man loses the time off work and pay, except I have seen it in a church in a Dutch background, in a Reformed church background, where they do pay the elders maybe a couple of $100 a day or whatever it is for the time that they are away at such a meeting. It's an interesting point. But another point, there's often criticism of the monetary reward that prominent or celebrity ministers, as they call them, receive, quite apart, I'm thinking, from the prosperity gospel preachers who have obscenely a large accumulation of funds. You look at the balance sheet, or the wealth of some of those preachers, and you can see the truth of what the apostle says, and they make merchandise of you. They do. But how should pastors be compensated? Godliness is not a means to financial gain. Some people in the ministry, even people who are not so unorthodox, you sometimes wonder, what are they in this for? Are they in it to really make money? In our own denomination, we set at our annual synod sets a minimum stipend, and that stipend has some regard, of course, to the overall situation in the community. But of course, some people will be working really hard. They've got gifts, they've got time, opportunity, they're flat out, and they will receive perhaps more by their congregation, who want to pay them more perhaps. But even so, we often call, in our tradition anyway, the ministers receive payment as a stipend. That is to say, it's not really what he's worth, but it's what he needs to provide reasonably for his family, and so on. So we need to think through those things and just make sure that we're mindful of looking after properly. Of course, you know the saying, keep them poor and keep them humble. Well, that's not a biblical way of putting it. But on the other hand, not one of the qualifications is not a person who is money hungry. Now, let's just look now at the final point that we got. We've looked at people who are not working so well, but those who are, and they're worthy of double honour. Now, what's the final point? Well, we're told that double honour is especially due to those whose work is preaching and teaching. So, what do we make of this? Let those who rule worthy be counted, the elders who direct the affairs of the church are worthy of double honour, especially those whose work is preaching and teaching. The implication is that all elders rule, but some, suitably gifted, have also a major role in preaching and teaching. That is obvious. Let the elders rule well, especially those whose focus is on preaching and teaching. That's what it's saying. So what do we make of this? The picture here is not of a radical distinction between two classes of elders, some who are ruling and others who are preaching and teaching. Now, in Presbyterian circles, it's quite common in certain cases, particularly in America, to specifically talk about a teaching elder, or a TE, and a ruling elder, an RE. And never the twain shall meet. They're quite separate. But in fact, the picture we have is that all elders rule, verse 17, and all are, of course, are to have aptitude for teaching, according to verse 2 of 1 Timothy chapter 3. So rather we should think not in terms of a radical difference and never the twain meeting, but rather we should think in terms of there being among the elders different degrees of gifting that qualify some for teaching and preaching as their major work. And in the Reformed tradition, there has been quite a debate on this point, really. There are those who hold a three-office view, we'll say. There are some who hold a four-office view, but we'll leave that out for the moment. That's probably a technical thing more anyway. Those holding a three-office view, they teach this, that you've got a teaching or preaching elder, commonly called a minister or pastor. Then you have the ruling elder, and then you have the deacons. But there are those who hold a two-office view. That is, that there are elders and deacons. And that within the eldership, there are some whose gifts suit them more particularly for preaching and teaching as a full-time kind of occupation. Now, Presbyterians have tended to a three-office view. But together with those who would rather speak in terms of a distinction within one eldership office, and that's me, I think, they follow a system that has built-in checks and balances, so that superiority without tyranny, equality without confusion, and subjection without slavery, to quote Alexander Henderson, one of the great Scottish men in this area, dating from the 17th century, is furthered. You see, in the Presbyterian system, you've got various courts beyond, or various assemblies of elders beyond the local congregation. So if you don't go beyond the local congregation, you can often have a problem, because someone can cause difficulty, and where do you go? It can be awkward. But if you've got the ability to go beyond that to another assembly, a wider assembly, you can get out of the emotional difficulties that may well be affecting the local congregation, and you can look at the matter and deal with it. So you have these graded assemblies of elders at the congregational, regional and national level, like really Israel did too, with the Sanhedrin at the top there. Now, so some Presbyterians then have got a three-office view, some have got a two-office view, but they've got a system in the Presbyterian system that's been developed over hundreds of years, so it tends to limit some of the difficulties that you can have where you don't have that. Of course, some Presbyterians, like Charles Hodge, following the compromise statement in the form of Presbyterial Church Government of the Westminster Assembly in 1645, they limit 1 Timothy 5:17 to ministers. And they derive elders from the gift of leadership or administration that is mentioned in Romans chapter 12 and also 1 Corinthians chapter 12. And they sometimes call these other church governors or lay elders. Now, that's not a view the Scots liked, but it was a compromise because the English didn't understand Presbyterianism. They hadn't had enough experience of it, apart from a bit in London. And so this was a compromise to get unity with a view to a national Presbyterian church, which fell apart, of course, because of the political developments. So you've got people having a difference here. And with Baptists, for example, many Baptists, not all, many Baptists limit the passage we're considering. They also limit it to pastors. But then they have other people working with the pastor and they normally call them deacons. So you've got here a lot of differences. And then you have confessional Reformed Baptists. I think you've heard of them. And they accept the principle of a plurality of elders in the local church. But then the difficulty they have experienced is separating out the roles in the body of elders adequately. And that can create a bit of difficulty. If every elder is seen as equally gifted and equally entitled to preach and so on, that's a problem. You know, that's the sensitive point for a confessional Baptist. So the fact that you've got those differences here does remind us that the Scriptures do not provide us a handbook of procedure in every particular situation. They give us principles of church government, but the details are not actually presented. And in fact, we have to say, I think, that church government, there are principles that you need to follow, because the way a church is governed will tell you a lot about where that church is going and how it resolves difficulties. And of course, church government is tied up with what you think is the real nature of the church. Is it only professedly regenerate believers? Or what about children of believers? How do they fit into it? And so on. So that's why there have been differences on this point. But you might ask, well, how was Timothy working? Here he was in Ephesus at this particular time. He was a man who had met Paul. First of all, we read about that in Acts chapter 16 and verse 1. In about 45 AD, this is when Timothy and Paul meet. And then he becomes the close friend and colleague of Paul, who was his mentor. Then he's marked out by prophecy, we're told, when he was set apart with the laying on of hands of the body of elders, verse 18 of chapter 1. And also in chapter 4, I think verse 14, is it? And Paul was involved in that setting apart, as he tells us in 2 Timothy 1 verse 6. So what was Timothy doing? Well, he was sort of a substitute for the apostle, I guess, looking after these churches in their early stages and probably ranging over a fair area. And he functioned, you might almost say, like a regional missionary superintendent or something like that. Now, that doesn't mean that we should abandon a particular view of church government that we have today, but it is a reminder that in extraordinary circumstances, extraordinary things may be done. Even in Scotland in the early Reformation in 1560, they didn't have enough ministers, so they appointed various superintendents. But they were not people who were bishops, as some historians have tried to argue that, but to try and bring the word of God to people, there were certain modifications that were adopted for a time. Later on, they were abandoned in 1578 when it wasn't so necessary. So what I'm trying to say is just be careful. We don't want to be landmark Baptists who think that Baptists have existed in unbroken line with perfect organisation down the line, any more than we want to be landmark Presbyterians, if there are any of those. But we do want to see here that the Scriptures are telling us godliness is vital in the church. It's vital among the people, and that chapter I referred to earlier is talking specifically among some of those difficulties between men and women and what they were doing, what they weren't doing, and so on. But it's important among the leadership. If the leadership goes astray, the church is likely to go astray too. So godliness is important. Some elders need to be rebuked. Some elders need to be removed in some circumstances, and we don't sufficiently recognise that, because we don't have enough sense of the holiness of God. You are to be holy, for I am holy. And you remember in Corinthians, there were things going on there, and they were proud about the sinful actions of one particular member. He had to be delivered to Satan for the destruction of his flesh, that the spirit might be saved in the day of Christ. And the discipline seems to have worked, according to the second letter. But they were, saying, oh, well, how liberal we are, we're pretty good, really. We're not tough people, we're nice people. But we're not being nice, allowing that. So sometimes you have to address those things. Hopefully it's rare. If we follow the wisdom of the apostle here, we don't lay hands hastily. At the same time, we don't dampen the desire of someone to desire the office of an overseer, which is a good thing. You're not going to be mature straight away. I sometimes wonder how I managed to get through the examination myself. Well, you do. They don't ask questions they should ask sometimes about a person, about their background. Have they got any hang-ups with their father or their mother, for that matter? What are the issues? What ability have they got to relate to other people? Are they really involved at all with other people, or they just keep in a narrow circle and they don't even know any other Christians and they've never spoken about Christ to anyone? Things like that. And have they ever preached? It was a requirement in my time that students not do too much preaching because you can get into bad habits before you know what the good habits are. Well, that's true, of course, but how can you assess someone's suitability unless you give them opportunity? So occasionally you will allow someone to preach who's not an elder because you want to see what gifts he's got. But very often you want to see people who are already doing things, and then other people say, well, look, we believe you're called to the ministry, and that person may well say, I've never thought of that. But then you've discerned the gifts, because what makes an elder is not the person saying, I believe God's called me. That's part of it. But in the normal situation, there's a desire for it, but there's also a recognition by the people of God. That's what's involved. That's why they're set apart. And it means the existing elders have to be guardians too. Guard the flock of God. The apostle told the Ephesians, you've been made overseers, so you've got to guard it against the sheep being hurt by people who are teachers of false doctrine, but also guard against the wrong leadership being brought in. So it's a demanding task, but it's an encouraging task too, to carry through this and to see God blessing those who are godly people, being set apart, and who work hard for the glory of Jesus Christ, the glory of our triune God. So I hope this is of some help to you, and understanding the passage and understanding the significance. Godliness in the congregation, that's the whole aim.